as we all know, France has been witnessing weeks of protests held by angry citizens known as the Yellow Vest movement. At first, it was anger over fuel tax hikes and taxes in general, the cost of living, but very quickly it spread to a much wider section of the population. And what we're feeling is anger against the political classes. And I have been curious to know how these protests have been seen by outsiders and visitors to France. So I've invited today in the studio a guest whose name is Dr Gemma King. She is a lecturer in French studies at the Australian National University in Canberra in Australia. And she's been in France for this past month with students, accompanying them for a course that is called Global Paris Culture, History and Identity in the French Capital. So I'm wondering how she has been witnessing these protests with her students and how it has perhaps changed her view of Paris and of France. History in the making, we could call it. Welcome to Paris Live, Gemma.
Thank you.
First of all, how many students were in the group with you and where are they from? What kind of students were in this group?
So there were 21 students and they were all Australian, but a very diverse group actually. So we had a wide range of ages and cultural backgrounds, genders, and also political sort of leanings as well. So we felt very privileged actually to be in Paris at this time, even though it was obviously, it's been a very tense moment and it's, not necessarily something that everybody is celebrating, but as a group coming all the way from Australia to France to study le patrimoine and cultural and political identity in France, we felt quite lucky to be here at this particular moment.
And I believe you arrived on the very first day that there were protests occurring on the 17th of November.
On the 17th of November. We arrived and we started officially on the 20th and we didn't really know what was hitting us at that time.
What was your first encounter as a group with the Yellow Vest? Did you come across any people in the streets yourselves, roadblocks, police perhaps telling you to stay away from certain areas? What was your first contact with the protest movement? Or was it on the television perhaps through images and media?
It was right on the streets that we first encountered it, but not as a group. So actually on the 22nd, we were at La Place La Concorde studying this concept of the axe, the way in which a certain area of Paris is constructed so that the Louvre is directly facing the Place La Concorde, which leads directly up the Champs-Élysées, right up to the Arc de Triomphe. And so we were standing in this famous square, and I was explaining to them the symbolism and the significance of the marches that occur from La Place La Concorde to l'Arc de Triomphe, something that harks back to the age of Napoleon Ier. But also is the way in which Le Tour de France finishes every year. And so
military parades.
Military parades. It was only a couple of weeks after Remembrance Day and the walk that many heads of state had taken together along that route. And we didn't actually walk up the Champs-Élysées, but when I was at La Place La Concorde, I said to them, in 2 days' time, it's the weekend, you can go up and see the Arc de Triomphe yourself if you want. I didn't realize what I was actually recommending that they do, of course. And some students came out of the metro on Saturday and saw the Arc de Triomphe on fire.
So they must have been quite impressed because some of them had never actually been to Paris before or never even left Australia. What were some of their first reactions to the violence, perhaps, and the destruction that they could see in the streets?
There was an element of shock and a little bit of fear, especially because we were receiving quite sensationalised messages from the Australian government saying, be aware that there is violence in the streets and that feeding into the images that they were seeing did cause them to be a little bit worried, but we were able to reconvene together and talk about the fact that, France is a nation that was built on popular uprising, and this isn't actually something new, but a continuation in French history. And so I think being in an educational environment and being able to debate these issues in French in Paris at the time really helped to give them a deeper understanding of what was happening rather than just, an immediate sort of reaction of fear.
yes, to go beyond the immediate reaction and dig a little bit deeper into what it relates to in terms of history and culture and things like that. So you really, certainly the whole time that your students were here, it was during this Yellow Vest movement, which is still going on. And your university course is called Global Paris, Culture, History and Identity in the French Capital. Why use the word global?
That's a great question. So the course primarily is actually a French language course. So the requirement was that students have an advanced French language level in order to come. But the real heart of the course is about examining how Paris is a city that is constructed to convey a certain notion of French cultural identity. And my aim as a cultural studies scholar was to deconstruct those stereotypes a little bit and to reveal to my students that actually Paris is an extremely culturally diverse city that is impacted by post-colonial heritage and legacies of all kinds of transnational flows between France and the rest of the world. And so Paris is this ultimate incarnation of Frenchness, if you like, but it's also so many other things that are international and transnational at the same time.
Yes, multi-layered.
Yes.
And in fact, your course outline speaks of getting students to obtain a deeper understanding of France's complex present. So you're not just dealing with the past, you're dealing with the present, the right here and now. What do you mean by complex present for France?
So one element that we kept coming back to when we would visit sites like, for example, le Musée du Quai Branly or the Palais de la Porte Dorée, which is the home of the Musée National de l'Histoire de l'Immigration, was that my aim was not to destroy their idealized fairy tale idea of Paris, but to deepen their understanding of what Paris actually is. So it wasn't about attacking the fact that France may be particularly hostile to immigration or hesitant to acknowledge its colonial past. That was definitely a part of it, but it was about examining truths and myths around the idea of Frenchness and trying to get the students not just to demonize or to idealize the Australian perspective of Paris, but to attempt to go deeper.
Because in fact, Australia and France, it might not seem that way, but the two countries actually do have a lot of things in common when it comes to migration. They both have to deal with this notion of multiculturalism, multilingualism, and the rise of immigration from the flows from different countries in the world, perhaps different flows, but they're both challenged by their identities as well. So it's an interesting parallel for your students.
Absolutely. It was a fascinating debate that we had amongst ourselves, talking about the quite stark differences that we noticed in certain at certain moments, and then the parallels and sometimes the unexpected parallels that the students encountered. So we talked very frequently actually about this concept of multiculturalism, which is quite widely promoted in Australia. It's quite politically popular as an idea, whereas in France we tend not to speak about le multiculturalisme, rather sort of favouring this notion of égalité as if you're French, then that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what your ethnic or racial or cultural or linguistic background is if you're French. And so there's this major difference in how we conceive of diversity and identity between France and Australia. And yet both countries are dealing with large waves of immigration in unsuccessful ways, and are both really struggling to decide how to proceed with the issue of immigration. So one thing that was really wonderful for me was to see how students were reflecting not only on their idea of France, but also were being prompted to think about Australia as well.
Yes. Yes. So do you think, so they've gone back home now, and you're looking back at how the course went and how they reacted to events in France. What were some of the things that stood out, perhaps the highlights, maybe the lowlights? So just a couple of things that sort of brought the course to a close, and maybe their last impressions as they went back home.
So you're asking this question at exactly the right time, because I'm currently marking their carnet de voyage, or travel journals that they submitted.
Written in French, of course.
Written in French, beautiful French, that they submitted just a couple of days ago. And so, I mean, we had all of these conversations together, but it's a really interesting moment for me to read their written reflections on how their perception of Paris evolved through the course. So these travel journals that they wrote, they would write on site at each museum or monument or chateau or site that we went to. They would have half an hour to reflect. And so it's quite raw material that they've submitted. And this recurring theme of their experience of revising their idea of what they thought France was just keeps coming up in all of the journal entries. And sometimes there's a little bit of disappointment in the tone. Not disappointment in the course, but disappointment that perhaps the fairy tale Paris that they had been dreaming about perhaps doesn't exist in the way that they thought it did. But there's also quite an uplifting underlying theme of feeling appreciative that they understand. I mean, the idea of the true Paris or the real Paris is problematic in itself, because there isn't one Paris, but they do all reflect on the fact that they feel like they know Paris much better than they did before.
And one aspect, just to finish up, one aspect I know that you personally appreciate very much about French culture is the cinema. Did you take your students to the cinema to see something French?
So that actually was the one thing that we didn't end up doing together, which is very unusual for me, because my primary research area is contemporary French cinema. And I did want to take them to Le Champeau in the 5e arrondissement and show them where Jean-Luc Godard used to skip school and go and watch films instead. We didn't end up doing it together, but I did give them very strong advice to spend their weekends in the cinemas. But it was something that came up thematically throughout, because cinema is fundamentally a construction of culture. And they have studied French cinema with me before in Canberra, and so we did refer back to that as a theme throughout.
And in fact, your book, one of your books, you've written two books, but the book about the cinema, Decentring France, Multilingualism and Power in Contemporary French Cinema, it seems to bring back the notion of, this we've been mentioning lingualism, but culturalism that exists in France and through cinema.
Yes, exactly.
Which is perhaps much richer than people imagine that French cinema is about.
That's right. So even though this course nominally sounds like something completely different to what I've been writing about in my work like Decentring France, the parallels are extremely strong in both projects. My aim is to reveal that there is a certain conception, perhaps monocultural conception of France and Frenchness that actually does not reflect the reality of contemporary France. And, going deeper into Paris today allows us to understand that, but also examining many different films that are coming out of France at the moment is a really illuminating way to understand the multilingual and multicultural reality of France.
Dr Gemma King, thank you so much for being the guest on Paris Live. And as I said to our listeners, you're a lecturer in French Studies at the Australian National University, Canberra. You're heading back to Australia tomorrow. Yes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.